Since 1976, the United States has executed over 1,500 people. Only 17 of them were women. This is the story of seven women, so different from each other, in background, in crime, in belief, that the only thing connecting them is the date and the method of their death, and the questions their stories leave behind, that no execution could ever answer. 7 most terrifying women ever executed in USA history. The full list, the shocking details, the psychology behind each death sentence. One of these women was executed despite the Pope, the President of the United States, and millions of people around the world demanding she be spared. One of them walked to her death voluntarily, refusing every appeal, asking for it to end. And one of them, number 1 on this list, was executed by the federal government for a crime so disturbing, so psychologically complex, that her case raised questions about mental illness, childhood abuse, and the limits of justice that the legal system has still not fully resolved. We are going to examine all 7, not just what they did, the psychology, the childhood, the moment that everything changed, and the question that every single one of these cases forces us to ask about ourselves. When a justice system sentences someone to death, how certain does it need to be that it has the full story? Number 7 is a name you already know, a woman whose story became a Hollywood film, whose last words were directed not at her victims, but at the sky. We start there, and we build to the one that will make you question everything you think you know about justice, mental illness, and what the United States did on a cold January morning in 2021. 7 women, 7 death sentences, 7 stories that the world is still not finished with. Let's begin. Before we meet the first woman on this list, before we examine what she did and why she did it, I need you to understand something about this documentary that separates it from every other true crime video you have watched today. We are not here to decide whether these women deserve to die. The courts already decided that. We are here to ask a harder question. Did we have the full story before we made that decision? Because here is what decades of research into female violent crime consistently shows. The pathway that leads a woman to the act that puts her on death row is almost never the simple, clean, straightforward story that a courtroom is designed to tell. It is almost always longer, older, more painful, and more directly connected to what was done to her before anyone asked what she had done to others. That does not make what these women did acceptable. It does not erase the victims. It does not simplify the grief of the families who lost people they loved, but it does make the story more complete, and a more complete story is the only one worth telling. Number 7, Aileen Carol Wuornos, born February 29, 1956, Rochester, Michigan. You have seen the 2003 film Monster. If you know the name Aileen Wuornos from popular culture, you think you know this story. You know the surface. Here is what the surface does not show. Aileen Wuornos never knew her father. He was in prison before she was born. He died there by suicide when she was a teenager. Her mother abandoned her when she was 4 years old. 4 years old, she and her brother were raised by their maternal grandparents, a situation that witnesses and records from her childhood describe as one of documented physical abuse. By the time Aileen Wuornos was 11, she was trading sexual acts with neighborhood boys for cigarettes and food. By 14, she had been sexually assaulted by a family friend and became pregnant. The child was given up for adoption. By 15, she was living on the streets, expelled from her grandparents' home. No parents, no support system, no institution that identified her as a child who needed protection and intervention. Just a 15-year-old girl on the streets of Michigan with no resources and no safety net, surviving the only ways available to her. This is the biography that preceded the crimes. This is the person that the Florida highway system encountered in the late 1980s, a woman in her 30s who had spent almost her entire life surviving in conditions that most people who later judged her could not imagine. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos shot and killed 7 men along Florida's highways. All 7 were men she had encounters with while working as a sex worker on those highways. Her claim, consistent from her arrest to her execution, was self-defense, that each of the men had attacked her, attempted to rape her, or threatened her life, that the killings were not predatory, they were reactive. The prosecution argued otherwise. They argued that the evidence at the crime scenes did not support a self-defense narrative, that the pattern of killings, 7 men, over more than a year, indicated premeditation rather than reaction. The jury agreed. Aileen Wuornos was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. But here is the element of the Wuornos case that the true crime summary always mentions and always moves past too quickly. She changed her story, not once, several times. She claimed self-defense. Then she recanted, saying she had made up the self-defense claims and had killed the men in cold blood. Then she returned to elements of the self-defense narrative. These contradictions were used by the prosecution to undermine her credibility, but the contradictions tell a different story to anyone familiar with the documented psychology of trauma survivors in legal settings, because a person who has spent decades surviving abuse, whose baseline relationship with authority figures is one of fear, distrust, and the learned understanding that honesty does not always produce safety, does not interact with the legal system the way a psychologically intact person does. They recant. They contradict themselves. They say what they think the person in front of them wants to hear, not because they are lying, but because survival has taught them that the truth is not always the safest answer. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on October 9, 2002. She was 46 years old. Her last meal was a cup of coffee. Her last words were 9 sentences that have been analyzed, debated, and cited in criminological literature. Ever since, she spoke about her belief that her soul would be taken by a spaceship. She spoke directly to no one in particular. She did not address the families of her victims. She did not apologize. She did not recant. Those last words, their specific, unusual, deeply personal content, raised a question that several psychiatrists and legal scholars have raised repeatedly in the 2 decades since her execution. Was Aileen Wuornos mentally competent to be executed? Not competent to stand trial. That is a different legal standard, but competent in the specific, legally defined sense of understanding the nature of the punishment being carried out and the reason it was being carried out. Her final statements suggested a belief system so disconnected from shared reality that several clinicians who reviewed them expressed serious concern. The state of Florida executed her anyway. Whether that was justice is a question this documentary cannot answer for you, but it is a question you should not be able to stop thinking about. Number 6. Margie Velma Barfield. Born October 29, 1932, Cumberland County, North Carolina. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was 52 years old. She wore pink pajamas. She was the first woman executed in the United States after the reinstatement of the death penalty, and she remains, in the documented history of death row psychology, one of the most psychologically complex cases ever studied, because Velma Barfield was not what most people imagine when they imagine a serial poisoner. She was a grandmother, a church-going woman from rural North Carolina, a woman who baked, who cared for elderly people, who was, by every outward measure, exactly the kind of person that no one around her would ever have suspected of the crimes she eventually confessed to. And that gap between the outward presentation and the interior reality is the most important psychological element of the Velma Barfield story, because it forces us to ask a question that is more uncomfortable than anything the crimes themselves raise. How well do we actually know the people closest to us? Velma Barfield killed 4 people with arsenic. Her second husband, Jennings Barfield, killed in 1969. Her mother, Lily Bullard, an elderly man she was employed to care for, and her fiancé, Stuart Taylor, whose death finally prompted an investigation that led back to all the others. But here is the element of Velma Barfield's story that the simple summary always omits, the element that does not make the crimes acceptable. Nothing could, but that makes the story human in a way that the simple summary does not allow for. Velma Barfield was a severe drug addict. Not recreationally, not casually. A person whose dependency on prescription medications, drugs that had been legally prescribed to her by doctors, following a series of genuine medical crises, had escalated to a level that had fundamentally altered her psychological functioning. Researchers who study the intersection of addiction and criminal behavior describe a state they call pharmacological disinhibition, the reduction of the brain's normal inhibitory mechanisms under the influence of certain substances, the part of the brain that says no, that says this is wrong, that generates the moral response that prevents most people from crossing certain lines. That part does not function normally in a person in the grip of severe chemical dependency. This is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. The law does not fully accept addiction as a defense, but it is a fact, a documented, neurologically grounded, research-supported fact, and the fact changes the story, not from guilty to innocent, but from a monster who killed 4 people, to a person whose brain chemistry had been so severely altered by a dependency that began with a prescription from a licensed doctor that she committed acts she would not have committed in her baseline state. Those are 2 different stories, and they produce 2 different questions about what justice was actually doing when it put Velma Barfield in pink pajamas. On November 2, 1984, after her arrest, Velma Barfield did something that became the most debated element of her case. She found religion, not in the performative, parole board friendly way that cynics and prosecutors tend to assume when an inmate becomes religious, but in a way that the chaplain at Central Prison, the other inmates, and the correctional officers who worked with her described consistently as genuine. She mentored other inmates. She counseled women who were struggling. She corresponded with people outside the prison about faith, recovery, and what it meant to reckon honestly with harm you had caused. Her case attracted the attention of Billy Graham, one of the most prominent religious figures in American history, who advocated publicly for clemency. Governor James Hunt refused. He was facing a tight re-election campaign, and execution in the weeks before the election was politically less costly than a clemency decision that opponents could use against him. A woman's life, a political calculation, a tight election. Velma Barfield was executed on schedule. Her case remains one of the most cited in academic discussions of the intersection between capital punishment, addiction, faith, and political timing. She killed 4 people. She was also a grandmother, an addict whose dependency began with a prescription, a woman whose transformation on death row was documented, incredible, and whose execution date was, by the documented record, influenced by an election calendar. Both things are true, simultaneously, without resolution, and that unresolved duality is exactly what makes her story impossible to dismiss and impossible to fully close. 2 women, 2 death sentences, 2 completely different crimes, 2 completely different psychological profiles. Aileen Wuornos, a child abandoned before she could walk, who survived in the only ways available to her, whose mental state at execution raised questions that were not answered before the lethal injection was administered. Velma Barfield, a grandmother in pink pajamas, whose addiction began with a prescription, whose faith was documented as genuine, and whose execution date was shaped in part by a political calendar. 2 women, 2 stories, the same question. Did we have the full story before we decided? In Act 2, we meet 3 more women whose cases push that question even further. A woman whose conversion on death row made the Pope, the President, and millions of people worldwide demand she be spared, and who was executed anyway. A woman who shot her husband and buried him in a wishing well in her own yard, and a woman who asked the state to execute her and meant it. That story is next. Aileen Wuornos spent her entire childhood surviving abuse, abandonment, and assault before she ever committed a crime. Velma Barfield's addiction began with a legal prescription from a licensed doctor. Neither of those facts makes what they did acceptable, but they do make the story more complete. Here is the question I want you to answer honestly. When a justice system decides to execute someone, how much of their full story does it have a responsibility to understand before it does? Is the crime enough? Or does context matter? There is no easy answer. That's exactly why I want to hear yours. We are down to 2. And before we reach number 1, before we deliver the story, this entire documentary has been building toward, I need to prepare you for something. The next 2 stories are not the kind you process easily. They are not the kind that leave you with clean feelings about justice, or about punishment, or about the systems we build to administer both. Number 2 is a story about what the federal government of the United States did on a cold January morning in 2021, and what the documented history of the woman they executed reveals about the gap between what the justice system is designed to do and what it actually does to the most psychologically damaged people it encounters. And number 1, the name at the top of this list, is a story about something quieter, something that operates not through violence, but through the slow, patient, almost invisible accumulation of harm. That is the most difficult kind of crime to detect, to prove, and to understand. 2 women, 2 completely different kinds of darkness, 2 stories the justice system found and processed, and 2 sets of questions it left completely unanswered. Number 2, Lisa Montgomery, born February 27, 1968, Wyandotte, Michigan. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. She was 52 years old. Her execution was the first federal execution of a woman in the United States in 68 years. The last federal female execution before Lisa Montgomery was Bonnie Brown Hetty, executed in 1953 in the gas chamber. 68 years. And the decision to end that 68-year pause with Lisa Montgomery, specifically with her, specifically in January 2021, specifically in the final days of an outgoing administration, is one of the most debated decisions in the recent history of American capital punishment. But before we examine the legal and political context of Lisa Montgomery's execution, we need to examine the life that preceded the crime, because the life that preceded the crime is the document that every court, every appeals process, every legal argument in the Montgomery case centered on, and it is the document that the federal government decided ultimately was not sufficient to change the outcome. Lisa Montgomery was born into a household of documented, severe, sustained abuse. Her stepfather began sexually abusing her when she was a child. The abuse was not hidden. It was known to adults in her life who did not intervene. As a teenager, her mother sold her for sex to plumbers and contractors who worked on the family home. Her mother sold her to tradesmen for home repairs. Take a moment with that, not because it excuses what Lisa Montgomery eventually did. It does not excuse it. Nothing about what she did can be excused, but because it is the foundational document of a human life, the earliest chapters of a story that the justice system encountered only at its most terrible conclusion. The abuse that Lisa Montgomery experienced produced what psychiatrists who evaluated her documented as severe complex post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative episodes, the fragmentation of identity, and reality testing. That is the documented outcome of sustained childhood trauma. At the level she experienced, her attorneys argued that Lisa Montgomery's mental illness, not as an excuse, but as a medical fact, was so severe, so directly traceable to the abuse she had experienced, that executing her was the legal equivalent of executing a person for the documented outcome of crimes committed against them before they were old enough to protect themselves. The federal court disagreed. On December 16, 2004, Lisa Montgomery traveled to Skidmore, Missouri. She had been communicating online with a young pregnant woman named Bobby Jo Stinnett. The 2 women shared an interest in dogs. They had corresponded about rat terriers. Lisa Montgomery arrived at Bobby Jo Stinnett's home, strangled her, and used a kitchen knife to perform a crude cesarean section, removing Stinnett's unborn baby girl. She took the baby. She drove home. She told her husband she had given birth. The baby survived. Bobby Jo Stinnett did not. There is no way to present this crime that makes it anything other than what it was, an act of extraordinary violence against a pregnant woman and a family that had done nothing to deserve what happened to them. Bobby Jo Stinnett was 23 years old. She was 8 months pregnant. She was at home. She had welcomed into her house a woman she believed shared her interest in dogs. Her family's grief is real. Her daughter, who survived, grew up without her mother. That loss is permanent. That harm is irreversible. And nothing about Lisa Montgomery's childhood, nothing about the documented abuse, the diagnosed mental illness, the dissociative episodes, returns Bobby Joe Stinnett to her family. Both things are true. The victim's loss is absolute. The perpetrator's documented mental illness is real. Both deserve to be held in the same frame, even when doing so is deeply uncomfortable. Lisa Montgomery's execution date was set in the final weeks of the outgoing Trump administration. Her attorneys made emergency appeals, citing her mental state. They presented evidence of severe mental illness, rooted in documented abuse. They argued that she did not fully understand the nature of her punishment. The courts declined the appeals. The Supreme Court cleared the way for the execution to proceed. In a late-night ruling, Amnesty International called the execution an act of cruelty and vengeance. Legal scholars pointed to the timing, the rush to execute in the final days of an administration, as evidence of political calculation rather than judicial process. The incoming administration had stated its intention to review federal executions. The outgoing administration executed Lisa Montgomery before that review could take place. Political timing and execution. January 2021, we saw that pattern with Velma Barfield. In 1984, an election, an execution date, a political calculation. It is a pattern that appears more than once in the documented history of American capital punishment, and every time it appears, it raises the same question. When is an execution a judicial act? And when is it something else? Lisa Montgomery was 52 years old when she was executed. Her last words were inaudible. The witnesses reported that she appeared disoriented. The execution proceeded regardless. Number 1. Judy Buenoano. Born April 4, 1943, Quanah, Texas. On March 30, 1998, Judy Buenoano was executed by electrocution at Florida State Prison. She was 54 years old. She was the first woman executed in Florida in 150 years, and she is number 1 on this list, not because her crimes were the most violent, though they were severe, not because her case was the most legally complex, though it raises significant questions, but because of what her specific method, her specific victims, and the specific pattern of her crimes reveals about the most difficult truth in the psychology of intimate partner violence and family-based harm. The most dangerous person in some lives is not a stranger. It is the person at the kitchen table. Judy Buenoano was known as the Black Widow, a nickname that is easy to use and that obscures more than it reveals, because the Black Widow label makes her sound like a predator who targeted strangers. She did not. She targeted the people who trusted her most. Her first husband, Air Force Sergeant James Buenoano, died in 1971. Judy collected his military life insurance. Her son Michael, her own child, died in 1980. He had been paralyzed in a prior accident and was receiving disability payments that Judy was collecting. He drowned in a canoeing accident. When the canoe capsized, police later determined his body showed evidence of arsenic poisoning, so extensive that he may have been too weakened to save himself. When the canoe went over, her son, Michael, 19 years old, the jury convicted Judy Buenoano of the murder of her son Michael. She was also a primary suspect in her first husband's death and in the attempted murder of her fiancé, who survived a car bombing that Judy was subsequently convicted of engineering. She maintained her innocence from her arrest to her execution, but the pattern, the documented, insurance-linked, family member-specific pattern of deaths and near deaths across 3 decades, was the subject of extensive forensic investigation that prosecutors presented as evidence of systematic, premeditated, financially motivated harm directed at the people who should have been safest in her world, the people who loved her, the people who trusted her, the people who sat at her table, ate her food, and had no reason to protect themselves from the person who was supposed to protect them. Every woman on this list was feared for a reason. Aileen Wuornos, because she was visible, because the crimes happened in a specific place, to a specific kind of victim. in a specific pattern that law enforcement could eventually track. Velma Barfield, because the poison was invisible, because the method bypassed every physical defense. Karla Faye Tucker, because of the violence of the act itself. Betty Lou Beets, because of the proximity. The husband in the yard, the wishing well, 20 feet from the door. Christina Marie Riggs, because of the incomprehensibility. The mother, the children, the voluntary death. Lisa Montgomery, because of the planning, the deception, the specific targeting of a pregnant woman's most vulnerable moment. Judy Buenoano is number one, because she represents something that all 6 of the other stories gesture toward, but none of them embodies as completely. The systematic, patient, financially motivated betrayal of trust. Not a single act, not a moment of violence, a pattern, across decades, across multiple victims, across relationships, specifically characterized by love, dependency, and the complete absence of any reasonable suspicion. The most terrifying thing a human being can do is not commit an act of sudden violence. The most terrifying thing a human being can do is maintain, for 30 years, the appearance of safety, while systematically destroying the people who trusted them. That is why Judy Buenoano is number one. On March 30th, 1998, Judy Buenoano was executed by electrocution at Florida State Prison. Florida was one of the last states to use the electric chair as its primary method of execution. She ate a last meal of steamed broccoli, strawberries, and coffee. She maintained her innocence to the end. She was 54 years old. Her son Michael, the child she was convicted of poisoning and drowning, had been 19 when he died. He would have been 37 on the day of his mother's execution. That number, 37, is the most important number in this entire story. Not the execution date, not the insurance payout, not the legal case number. 37, the age Michael Buenoano never got to be. 7 women, 7 death sentences, 7 stories that refuse to be simple. In Act 4, our final act, we step back from the individual cases and ask the question that all 7 stories have been building toward. Not about these women specifically, but about the system that processed them, about what it means to build a justice system that is designed to deliver final, irreversible answers, and then to use it on cases that the evidence shows were anything but final or fully understood. That question is the most important one in this documentary, and it is next. Lisa Montgomery was executed by the federal government in the final days of an outgoing administration, after courts denied emergency appeals based on documented severe mental illness rooted in childhood abuse. Judy Buenoano maintained her innocence for decades while the evidence against her was entirely circumstantial and pattern-based. 2 completely different cases, 2 completely different legal arguments, but the same irreversible outcome. Here is the question: should the documented history of severe childhood abuse, the kind that psychiatrists confirm produces measurable, permanent changes in brain function, be a factor that prevents a death sentence? Not reduces it, prevents it entirely. Answer honestly below. This is one of the most debated questions in criminal justice, and your perspective matters. 7 women, 7 death sentences, 7 mornings that each ended the same way, and 7 sets of questions that did not end when the sentence was carried out. Because that is the thing about an execution, that the word itself obscures. The word execution sounds final, sounds like a closing, like the last page of a story that has been fully told. It is not. An execution is the permanent foreclosure of the possibility of a more complete answer. It is the moment when the justice system says, we have enough, we know enough, we are certain enough, and then makes that certainty irreversible, with a needle, with an electric charge, with a lethal chemical, with the full institutional weight of the most powerful government on earth. And what the 7 stories in this documentary have shown us, collectively, cumulatively, across 7 different women, 7 different crimes, 7 different states, across almost 4 decades of American capital punishment, is that the certainty the system claims when it executes someone is almost never as complete as the act of execution requires it to be. Look at the 7 women on this list. Look at what they share, not the crimes. The crimes are different, not the states. For different states, federal government, not the methods, lethal injection, electrocution. What they share is something that emerges from their documented histories with a consistency that is impossible to ignore. Once you see it, every single one of them had a documented history of severe childhood trauma, abuse, or institutional abandonment that preceded the crimes by years or decades. Aileen Wuornos, abandoned at 4, on the streets at 15, surviving assault before she was old enough to vote. Velma Barfield, a childhood marked by hardship, a dependency that began with a legal prescription, a life shaped by the specific poverty of rural North Carolina in the mid-20th century. Karla Faye Tucker, drug-addicted teenager, present at a murder she committed in a state that psychiatrists described as chemically and psychologically altered. Betty Lou Beets, documented victim of domestic abuse across multiple marriages, a history that her defense argued was directly relevant to the crime. The jury ultimately refused to consider. Christina Marie Riggs, documented severe depression, a healthcare system that failed to identify or adequately treat a mental illness that was visibly deteriorating in the months before the crime. Lisa Montgomery, documented childhood abuse of a severity that produced clinically confirmed severe mental illness in an adult whose reality testing was so compromised that multiple psychiatrists expressed doubt about her competency to be executed. Judy Buenoano, a childhood marked by poverty, instability, and the specific, documented disadvantage of a young woman with no resources in mid-century rural Texas. 7 women, 7 documented histories of disadvantage, abuse, or mental illness that preceded the crimes. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern, and the research on this pattern is extensive, consistent, and almost entirely absent from the public conversations about capital punishment that these cases generate. A landmark study published in the Journal of Traumatology found that the overwhelming majority of women on death row in the United States had documented histories of physical or sexual abuse. A review of capital cases by the American Bar Association found that inadequate mental health investigation at the trial stage was one of the most consistent factors in wrongful conviction and in the imposition of the death penalty in cases where a lesser sentence might have been more appropriate. The pattern is documented, the research is clear, and yet the executions continue. Why? Before we answer that question, we owe it to the full complexity of this issue to take seriously the argument for capital punishment because it exists. It is made by serious people, and dismissing it without engaging with it would be exactly the kind of incomplete analysis this documentary has been arguing against. The argument goes like this. The victims of these crimes were real people. Bobby Joe Stinnett was 23 years old and 8 months pregnant. Michael Buenoano was 19 years old and dependent on his mother for his survival. The 2 people killed by Karla Faye Tucker in their own home had done nothing to deserve what happened to them. The men killed along Florida's highways, the people poisoned at family tables, the husband buried in the yard. These were real losses, real grief, real families who lost real people in real ways that nothing in any justice system can fully address. The argument continues. The death penalty, its defenders argue, is not about the perpetrator. It is about the victim, about the acknowledgement that some crimes are so severe, some losses so irreplaceable, that the only response the justice system can make that adequately reflects the weight of that loss is the permanent removal of the person who caused it. It is about finality for families who have been told to keep reliving the worst moment of their lives through appeals processes that can extend for decades. It is about the specific, legitimate, deeply human demand that a justice system reflect the values of the society it serves, and that in some cases, those values include the belief that certain acts forfeit the right to continued existence. This argument is made in good faith by people who have thought seriously about it. It deserves a serious response. Here is the serious response. The argument for capital punishment as a reflection of victim-centered justice rests on a premise that the 7 stories in this documentary consistently undermine the premise that the system has the full story when it decides to execute, because victim-centered justice requires that the person being executed is definitively, completely, without reasonable doubt, the correct person. It requires that the sentence reflects not just the crime as documented, but the full moral weight of the crime. including the perpetrators, psychological state, their history, their capacity for understanding, and responsibility. It requires that the process was not shaped by political timing, by prosecutorial pressure, by the specific racial and economic biases that the research consistently documents in death penalty cases, and it requires that the finality is reserved for cases where the certainty is absolute. In the 7 cases in this documentary, that certainty was not absolute. Not in Aileen Wuornos' case, where the mental competency question was never fully resolved. Not in Velma Barfield's case, where the execution date was shaped by an election calendar. Not in Karla Faye Tucker's case, where a global consensus, including religious leaders, political figures, and millions of ordinary people, concluded that the person being executed was not the same person who committed the crime. Not in Lisa Montgomery's case, where documented severe mental illness raised legitimate questions about the nature of her responsibility that no court fully addressed before making the decision. Irreversible. These are not arguments that the crimes did not happen. They did. They were severe. The losses were real. They are arguments that the system that decided to respond with irreversible finality did not have the full story, and that executing someone without the full story is not justice. It is a different thing entirely. The United States is one of only a small number of developed democracies that still practices capital punishment. The European Union prohibits it entirely. Canada abolished it in 1976, Australia in 1984, the United Kingdom in 1998. In the countries that have abolished capital punishment, the argument was not primarily that murderers do not deserve to die. The argument was simpler and more honest. We cannot be certain enough. The justice system is a human system. It is operated by humans. It processes human beings through institutions that are shaped by human biases, human errors, human political calculations, and human limitations. And a human system that makes irreversible decisions will eventually make irreversible mistakes. Since 1973, more than 190 people have been exonerated from death row in the United States. 190 people who were sentenced to death by a system that was certain enough to make the decision and wrong. 190. None of the 7 women in this documentary were exonerated, but the same system that processed them, the same courts, the same legal standards, the same institutional framework also processed those 190 people who were innocent. The system does not know which cases are which. At the moment it decides. That is the problem. What did these 7 women deserve? It is the question that every case in this documentary ultimately demands. And here is the most honest answer this documentary can offer. They deserved a justice system that had the full story before it decided, not a system that processed their crimes as isolated acts disconnected from the documented histories that produced them, not a system whose decisions were shaped by political calendars and election cycles, not a system that executed a woman in January 2021 without fully resolving the question of whether her mental illness, rooted in documented childhood abuse, was severe enough to have prevented her from forming the criminal intent the law requires for the most severe punishment. The victims deserved a justice system with a full story too. Bobby Joe Stinnett deserved a justice system that could explain what produced the woman who killed her, not just for the purposes of the Montgomery case, but for the purposes of every future case that begins with the same documented pattern of childhood abuse and severe mental illness. Michael Buenoano deserved a justice system that could explain how a mother reaches the point of poisoning the son she was trusted to protect, and what institutions might have intervened to prevent it. The families of Aileen Wuornos' victims deserved a justice system that could explain the full trajectory of the woman who killed their loved ones, a trajectory that began in a Michigan home in the 1950s and was shaped at every stage by institutions that failed to intervene. Full stories serve everyone, not just the perpetrators, the victims too. Scene, the final thought. 7 women, 7 death sentences, 7 mornings that ended the same way, and one question that none of those mornings could answer. How certain does a justice system need to be before it makes a decision that cannot be unmade? The United States has answered that question with a legal standard called beyond a reasonable doubt. It is a high standard. It is higher than the standards used in civil courts. It is higher than the standards used in most other legal systems. But it is not certainty. It is reasonable doubt. And in the 7 cases in this documentary, in the documented mental illness, the political timing, the incomplete investigations, the suppressed evidence, the global consensus of people who looked at one case and said not yet, not like this, not without the full story, there was reasonable doubt. The United States will likely continue to debate capital punishment. For decades, the cases will continue, the executions will continue, and the questions will continue to outlast them, as they have with these 7 women. Aileen Wuornos, who asked the sky for something in her last 9 sentences that the justice system never gave her. Velma Barfield, in her pink pajamas, 2 days before an election. Karla Faye Tucker, whose execution, a sitting American president, a future president, and the leader of the world's largest Christian church, all asked to be stopped. Betty Lou Beets, whose defense of abuse the jury was not permitted to fully hear. Christina Marie Riggs, who asked the state to execute her because grief had become more than she could carry. Lisa Montgomery, executed in January 2021, in the final hours of an outgoing administration, disoriented, according to witnesses, on the morning of her death. And Judy Buenoano, number 1, whose son Michael would have been 37 the year she was executed. 7 women, 7 stories, 7 sets of questions that the executions did not close. That is the only conclusion this documentary is able to offer. The questions are still open. They will remain open until we build a justice system that earns the certainty it claims before it acts with finality. We are not there yet. This has been 7 most terrifying women ever executed in USA history. The full list, the shocking details, full documentary. This changed the way you think about justice. Share it with someone who thinks the questions were answered. They weren't. They never are. Subscribe. The next story is waiting. 7 women, every single one with a documented history of severe childhood trauma, abuse, or mental illness that preceded their crimes by years or decades. More than 190 people have been exonerated from U.S. death row since 1973, people the system was certain enough about to sentence to death and wrong. The countries that have abolished capital punishment did not do so because they believed murderers deserved mercy. They did so because they accepted one honest truth. A human system that makes irreversible decisions will eventually make irreversible mistakes. So here is the question I want you to sit with and answer in the comments. If the justice system cannot guarantee that it has the full story, if it cannot guarantee that it is not making an irreversible mistake, does it have the moral authority to make irreversible decisions at all? Leave your most honest answer below. There is no right answer, but there is an honest one, and I want to hear yours.